In December 1972, Eastern Airlines Flight 401 fell from the sky into the Florida Everglades, killing over 100 people. But the story didn't end there. Months later, flight crews reported something impossible. Faces of dead pilots appearing in the aisles, warnings whispered from empty seats, and photographs of men who never aged. Parts from the wreckage had been reused in other planes, and wherever those pieces went, the ghosts followed. This is not just the story of a crash. It is the story of the plane that refused to die.
December 29, 1972, Miami International Airport. The Christmas crowds were thinning, but one gate was still alive with movement. Families tugging on coats, couples whispering about New Year's plans, businessmen checking their watches. At Gate 47, Eastern Airlines Flight 401 was preparing for its late-night run to New York. The aircraft was a Lockheed L1011 TriStar gleaming under fluorescent lights. Brand new, state-of-the-art, billed as one of the safest planes in the world. To most passengers, it was just another flight, but some of them would never make it home. Boarding began a little after 11 p.m. Parents carried sleeping children. College students lugged duffel bags. One man clutched a briefcase so tightly that even when the flight attendant offered to stow it, he shook his head. Everyone had their own story, their own reasons for flying. No one could have guessed they were about to share the same fate. The crew in the cockpit was seasoned. Captain Robert Avery had logged over 30 years in the air. Calm, confident, the kind of pilot who could land a plane in a storm without breaking a sweat. Beside him sat First Officer Daniel Lowe, younger but sharp, meticulous about every checklist. And at the engineer's station was Carl Hayes, a man who knew the aircraft's wiring better than most mechanics. The three of them had flown together before. They trusted each other. At 11:32 p.m., the L1011 roared down the runway and lifted into the night. Passengers leaned back as the city lights shrank below, replaced by the endless black of the Florida Everglades. Inside, the hum of the engines became a lullaby. Flight attendants moved down the aisles with drinks, coffee, sodas, tiny bottles of liquor. Most passengers settled in quickly, whispering in the dim light, flipping through magazines, drifting towards sleep. It felt like any other flight, too normal, too safe. An hour later, as the plane approached the Miami coastline, something small disrupted the calm. On the control panel, one tiny green light refused to glow. It was the landing gear indicator. Normally, when the nose gear locked into place, the light confirmed it, but now the bulb stayed dark. It could have been nothing more than a faulty bulb, but it could also mean the nose gear wasn't locked. No pilot could risk landing without checking. Captain Avery radioed air traffic control and requested a holding pattern over the Everglades while the crew sorted it out. The announcement to passengers was calm, almost casual. "We're experiencing a minor technical delay," the captain said. Most passengers barely reacted. They adjusted their blankets, sipped their drinks, closed their eyes again. But in the cockpit, tension was building. The first officer tried cycling the gear. The sound of machinery hummed beneath the cabin floor, but the light stayed out. Hayes, the engineer, pulled the bulb assembly, twisting it, checking the wiring with a flashlight. He muttered that it might just be loose, but he couldn't be certain. The three men focused on the small square of plastic as if their entire flight depended on that one stubborn green glow. What none of them noticed was the slow drift in altitude. With autopilot set but not monitored, the plane gradually sank lower, its nose dipping ever so slightly toward the swamp below. In the cabin, a few passengers looked out the windows and wondered why the dark marshland seemed closer. But no one said anything. At 11:42 p.m., the left wing clipped the surface of the Everglades. In an instant, the jet tore apart. Metal screamed. Fuel ignited. The swamp lit up as if midnight had turned to noon. Inside, chaos erupted. Passengers thrown from seats, luggage exploding from overhead bins, fire rushing through the fuselage. When the wreckage finally came to rest, the silence was deafening. The sound of hissing steam, the crackle of fire, the cries of survivors were the only proof life still existed among the mangled steel. Out of 163 people on board, 101 were killed instantly. 62 lived long enough to be pulled from mud and water by rescuers who raced into the swamp. The rescue itself was something out of a nightmare. Helicopters hovered low, spotlights cutting across the black marsh. Airboats churned through reeds. Survivors clung to floating debris, their faces blackened with smoke, their arms shredded by jagged metal. Many described the same thing. The plane had simply fallen out of the sky. When investigators reached the cockpit wreckage, one detail froze them. The nose gear indicator bulb, the tiny green light that had caused so much trouble, was intact. It had never been broken. There had never been a fault. The crash was devastating, but the story of Flight 401 wasn't finished. In fact, it was only beginning, because months later, long after the wreckage was cleared and the survivors tried to rebuild their lives, strange reports started to surface. Flight attendants whispered about seeing faces they recognized in planes that had been repaired with parts salvaged from Flight 401. Faces of crew members who had died in the crash. And every time, those faces were wearing the same calm expressions they had in the cockpit just before everything went dark.
The morning after the crash, headlines across the country screamed the same words: Eastern Flight 401 down in the Everglades. Newspapers carried grainy photographs of twisted wreckage half buried in swamp water, with rescuers wading chest-deep among it. Survivors told reporters about the chaos, the fire, the smell of burning fuel mixed with rotting vegetation. But none of them could explain the same detail, why the jet had simply dropped from the sky. The official investigation began immediately. The National Transportation Safety Board combed through every inch of the wreckage. Investigators laid pieces of the plane on massive hangar floors like a giant broken puzzle. Engineers traced wiring, checked hydraulics, pulled apart engines. The conclusion was both simple and tragic. The crew had become distracted by a single bulb, a 50-cent piece of plastic, and no one noticed the slow descent until it was too late. Human error, they called it. Nothing more. But to Eastern Airlines, the wreckage wasn't just tragedy, it was inventory. The L-1011 was a brand new aircraft, barely a year old. Many parts were undamaged, and in the airline business, nothing went to waste. Seats, galleys, ovens, sections of flooring, even cockpit panels were salvaged. Those parts were quietly installed into other TriStar jets across the fleet. It was efficient, it was practical, and it was the decision that gave birth to one of the strangest chapters in aviation history. The first reports came from cabin crew months later. Flight attendants whispered about ovens that turned on by themselves, serving carts that rolled unassisted, and seats that felt warm, as if someone had just been sitting in them, though the row was empty. At first, these were dismissed as stress, fatigue, or simple malfunctions. But then came the faces. On a flight from Miami to Atlanta, a flight attendant serving drinks to first class suddenly dropped her tray. Seated in 3C was a man she recognized instantly, Captain Robert Avery. The problem was, Avery had died in the crash of Flight 401. She blinked, and he was gone. Only the untouched seat remained. Weeks later, on a different TriStar, a passenger rang the call button and complained about the man sitting quietly in the jump seat near the galley. The crew went to check. One stewardess froze. The man wasn't a passenger. It was flight engineer Carl Hayes, dead since December. The stewardess swore he looked real, solid, alive. She spoke to him, and he warned her in a low, calm voice. Check the engines. Moments later, the pilots discovered a mechanical fault serious enough to delay takeoff. The plane might have been lost if it had gone airborne. Word spread quickly through Eastern's crews. At first, no one wanted to talk about it. Who would believe them? But the stories multiplied. Pilots reported seeing Lowe's reflection in cockpit glass. Attendants swore Avery had appeared in the aisles mid-flight. Some passengers described entire conversations with men who weren't listed on the manifest. Every time, the descriptions matched the dead crew of Flight 401. Management at Eastern tried to shut it down. Officially, there were no ghosts, no sightings, no supernatural interference. But off the record, airline supervisors kept a quiet log. Dozens of sightings across multiple planes, and always on aircraft that carried salvaged parts from Flight 401. The rumors became impossible to ignore when an entire cockpit crew refused to fly. During pre-flight checks, both pilots and a flight engineer saw Captain Avery standing in the galley. One of them even spoke to him. Avery allegedly looked at the men and said, "There will never be another crash. We will not let it happen again." Then he vanished before their eyes. The log of these incidents, suppressed by Eastern, described him as calm, reassuring, protective. Not haunting, not malicious, but undeniably present. Passengers began hearing the whispers too. Word leaked into the press. "Ghosts of Flight 401, the headline said. Some dismissed it as urban legend. Others swore the testimonies were too consistent to ignore. Eastern Airlines eventually removed every salvaged part from their fleet, quietly phasing them out without ever admitting the reason. But for those who had seen Avery, Lowe, or Hayes, it didn't matter. They believed something from Flight 401 had carried on long after the crash. Not wreckage, but people. And then came the report that changed everything. On a late-night flight out of Newark, a passenger took a photograph of the cabin as attendants prepared for takeoff. When the film was developed, one row showed something impossible. In the window reflection beside a woman fastening her seatbelt was a face. Pale, calm, watching. It was Captain Avery, and his eyes, they said, were looking directly into the camera.
By 1974, Eastern Airlines staff had a nickname for the rumors they weren't supposed to mention. They called it the 401 Club. Anyone who claimed to see something, hear something, or talk to someone who shouldn't be there was part of it. Officially, it didn't exist. But in break rooms and overnight layovers, stories circulated like wildfire. On one flight from Tampa to Miami, a stewardess was preparing coffee when she felt someone standing behind her. She turned, expecting another crew member. Instead, she saw a man in uniform, Captain Avery. She froze, coffee pot in hand, as he looked her in the eye and said, "There's fire in the compartment." Startled, she called the cockpit. The pilots checked, and sure enough, an electrical short had sparked near the cargo hold. If it hadn't been caught in time, the fire could have brought the plane down. When she looked back, Avery was gone. Another incident rattled the crew of a TriStar headed to Orlando. Passengers complained about a silent man seated in 23B who wouldn't respond to questions. The flight attendant asked for his boarding pass. The man didn't move. When she touched his shoulder, her hand passed through empty air. Witnesses swore the seat had been occupied, but the manifest had no one listed for 23B pilots weren't immune either. A first officer performing a routine pre-flight check said he saw someone sitting in the engineer S station, Carl Hayes. Hayes didn't speak, just nodded slightly as if approving the younger man's work. By the time the captain arrived, the seat was empty, but the instruments Hayes had been monitoring were all correctly set, something the first officer insisted he hadn't touched yet. Patterns emerged. The sightings never happened on random aircraft. Always on planes fitted with salvaged parts from Flight 401. Ovens, seats, floor panels, even sections of the cockpit. If a TriStar carried pieces from the wreckage, sooner or later someone would see them, and the appearances were never violent. Not once. Every story described the same calm expressions, the same quiet warnings. Almost as if the dead crew of Flight 401 had stayed behind, protecting other flights from suffering the same fate. But the sheer number of testimonies made it harder to dismiss. Pilots who prided themselves on discipline, attendants who had flown for decades, even passengers with no reason to invent such stories. They all described the same faces: Avery, Lowe, Hayes, the men who should have been buried in the Everglades. One chilling case came from a TriStar en route to Dallas. A flight attendant swore she had seen Lowe standing near the emergency exit mid-flight. She thought he was another passenger until she recognized the uniform. He looked at her, then pointed silently at the door handle. Moments later, pressure gauges in the cockpit indicated a problem with the door seal. If it hadn't been caught in time, the cabin could have decompressed at 30,000 feet. The engineers fixed it. The flight landed safely. But the story didn't end there. A passenger had been taking home movies with an old Super 8 camera. When the footage was developed in one frame, just a split second, a figure in uniform appeared at the edge of the aisle. The man's face was blurry but recognizable. It was Lowe. The airline confiscated the film within days. The passenger never got it back. Eastern management grew desperate. They warned employees not to talk to the press, not to encourage the stories. Threats of termination followed. But still, the sightings came, and not just in whispers. A captain and his first officer, both senior, respected, filed an official report after seeing Avery in the cockpit during pre-flight. They wrote that he appeared real, solid, seated in the jump seat. He looked at them both and said calmly, "You do a good job." Then he vanished. The report was buried, but copies leaked, circulating among crews who already believed. To skeptics, it was mass hysteria, a coping mechanism for those traumatized by the crash. But to believers, it was something else. Proof that the dead could linger. Proof that maybe Flight 401 had never really left the skies. And then came the strangest account of all. On a flight from Boston, a passenger rang the call button and asked the attendant about the uniformed man sitting quietly near the galley. When she went to check, she recognized him immediately, Carl Hayes. She nearly dropped the drinks in her hand. But the passenger was calm. He said Hayes had spoken to him. That Hayes had told him, "You'll be safe. We're watching." That passenger had no connection to Eastern. He didn't know the names of the crash victims. And when shown a set of photos later, he pointed to Hayes without hesitation. By the mid-1970s, Flight 401 had become legend. Crews swapped stories and whispers. Passengers traded rumors in waiting lounges, and investigators tried to dismiss it all. But every time a new sighting emerged, one detail remained the same. The men of Flight 401 didn't just appear. They appeared only when something was wrong. And when they did, planes were saved.
By 1976, the whispers had become too loud to ignore. Crews across Eastern Airlines spoke of Flight 401 like it was a secret religion. They traded stories like relics, Avery in a reflection, Lowe in a seat, Hayes giving warnings that saved lives. But the more consistent the sightings became, the more the airline tried to bury them. Officially, Eastern's position was clear. There were no ghosts. The crash was a tragedy caused by human error, nothing more. Yet behind closed doors, some investigators weren't so sure. A quiet memo circulated among safety inspectors, never meant for public release. It cataloged dozens of incidents, sudden equipment checks triggered by phantom warnings, doors resealed at the last moment, fires discovered before they could spread. In nearly every case, a crew member swore a dead man had pointed it out. The memo carried one haunting line at the bottom. If these events are fabrication, they are consistent fabrications. But the strangest part wasn't the testimonies. It was the timing. Every sighting seemed to happen on Saturdays. Not always the same route, not always the same hour, but the day remained constant. Saturday. Investigators cross-referenced dates, looking for coincidences. They found none. It wasn't random, it was routine. Some suspected trauma, flight crews unconsciously reliving the night of the crash. which had happened on a Saturday. But then the pattern grew darker. Each time a ghost appeared, within 72 hours, someone unrelated to the flight would vanish. A passenger who had been seen boarding but never checked out. A ground crew member who failed to show up for his next shift. A maintenance worker who simply disappeared after finishing a repair. Newspapers didn't connect the dots, but the logs did. Witnessed, vanished, over and over again. Detective Clara Monroe from Miami-Dade was one of the few who looked deeper. She interviewed survivors, questioned attendants, reviewed logs, Eastern wanted forgotten. She pinned photographs to her wall. The crash site, the faces of Avery, Lowe, Hayes. And in the corner, she added photographs of those who had disappeared afterward. There was no link between them. No shared age, no shared occupation, no shared background. The only common thread, they were always in the orbit of a sighting. Monroe pushed for answers. Eastern pushed back. Files vanished from archives. Reports were marked confidential. When she asked to interview surviving engineers about the salvaged parts, she was told they had been reassigned. Within a year, she was forced off the case entirely. But before she left, she uncovered something chilling. Photographs. Not just one, but 5. Different cities, different years. Each one a casual snapshot. A crowd at a gate, a maintenance crew posing by an aircraft, passengers boarding. And in the background, faint but clear, was a familiar face. Sometimes a reflection in glass, sometimes half-turned, sometimes staring directly at the camera. It was Captain Avery. The earliest photo dated back to 1974. The latest was from 1976. In both, Avery looked identical. No aging, no blur of movement, as if he had been placed there deliberately, like a stamp. Monroe sent the photos for analysis. The results came back unsettling. The bone structure matched, the height matched, the features matched, and yet, one note in the report stood out. These images are consistent with a subject photographed on the same day, despite a 2-year gap. For Monroe, the pattern was clear. The crash hadn't ended on December 29, 1972. Something had carried on. The salvaged parts had been the trigger, but the phenomenon was larger. The dead crew weren't haunting, they were watching, recording, choosing, and perhaps protecting. Because in every documented sighting, no plane had been lost. Malfunctions, fires, decompression, all stopped in time. As if Avery and his crew had sworn no one else would. By 1979, Eastern Airlines had quietly removed most of the salvaged parts from their TriStar fleet. Officially, it was routine maintenance. Unofficially, crews whispered that the ghosts had forced their hand. Every oven, every seat, every panel traced back to Flight 401 was stripped out, catalogued, and sealed in storage. The sightings slowed, reports dwindled. For a while, it seemed as if the story of Flight 401 was finally fading into memory. But the quiet didn't last. In the spring of 1981, one of the last TriStars, still carrying original 401 components, was scheduled for decommissioning. Aircraft N310EA. Its final run would be a short overnight flight from New Orleans back to Miami, where it would be retired. Most of the crew didn't know, or pretended not to know, that parts of its galley, wiring, and even one cockpit panel had once belonged to the doomed jet. The flight was half full, mostly business travelers, a handful of tourists, a few airline staff hitching a ride. Takeoff was smooth, the cabin quiet, the night uneventful, until just after midnight. A stewardess in the forward galley heard a familiar sound, the distinct click of the engineer ES panel being adjusted. She thought it was one of the pilots checking instruments. But when she peeked into the cockpit, both men were seated at their stations. No one stood at the panel. Minutes later, a passenger pressed the call button. He complained about the man seated beside him in 14A who wouldn't respond. When the attendant checked, the seat was empty. The passenger insisted otherwise. He said the man wore a uniform. He said the man whispered, "Last flight." The crew grew uneasy. The captain kept the plane steady, his voice calm, but in the cabin, murmurs spread. Strange drafts of cold air, lights flickering overhead, a galley cart rolling by itself, stopping neatly beside row 23, the same row where survivors from the original crash once said they heard the first impact. Then came the warning. The first officer glanced at his reflection in the cockpit glass and saw another face beside his own. Calm, steady. Wearing the uniform of a captain, Robert Avery. The young officer froze as Avery's reflection leaned closer and said, "Check the hydraulics." The officer snapped out of it, checked the gauges, and realized the system was losing pressure. The plane was seconds from a catastrophic failure. Emergency procedures were executed, backups engaged, and the TriStar leveled. Disaster was averted. But when the captain turned to his co-pilot to ask what had happened, the young man was pale, trembling. He swore he hadn't been alone in that cockpit. As the plane descended toward Miami, passengers described an eerie calm. Some said they saw men in uniforms walking the aisles, hands resting on seatbacks, faces half lit by cabin lights. Others said the air smelled faintly of smoke, as if the swamp itself had seeped into the cabin. The landing was safe. The jet rolled to a stop at Miami International. Passengers disembarked. No one was hurt, but the crew, shaken and pale, filed reports that would never see daylight. The aircraft was quietly retired the next morning. Its parts were scrapped, its frame dismantled. None of Flight 401's remains were ever used again, and after that, the sightings stopped. At least that's what Eastern claimed. For years, the airline denied everything. They said the stories were myths, exaggerations, folklore born from tragedy. But among pilots, attendants, and even some investigators, belief lingered. The ghosts of Flight 401 hadn't vanished. They had simply gone where no one could follow. One final story refused to die. A janitor cleaning the hangar where N310EA had been dismantled swore he saw 3 men standing near the stripped fuselage. One older, calm, in a captain's uniform. One younger, sharp-eyed. One stocky with grease on his hands. They didn't move. They didn't speak. They just watched as the last pieces of their plane were taken apart. When the janitor turned back, the hangar was empty. Today, nearly 50 years later, survivors still tell their stories. Pilots still whisper about the men who warned them in time. And passengers still remember the calm faces in uniforms that no longer existed. Flight 401 was supposed to end in the Everglades, but it didn't. Because some tragedies don't stop when the engines fail. Some carry on, stitched into metal and memory, until the very last piece is gone. And maybe even longer.